Okay, for this lesson, we're going to talk about shading, and we're going to talk about light and just a little bit about value. The first thing we want to understand actually is when we look at something that has volume, or it looks like it's round and it has shading to it, what are we actually looking at? Well, we're actually looking at some type of object that's interacting with light. So essentially, if our object here is a ball and we have light coming at it from an angle, like from the upper right here, and it's a pretty strong light, what we'll find is that we have on this side over here we have light, and this side over here obviously we'll have dark. Okay, so let's just say our shape of darkness or shadow is just about over here on this ball, and let's just say we also have not just this sort of shadow part here, which is called a core shadow, but we also have below it a shadow too, and this would be called a cast shadow. What's actually happening here is, as long as the surface of this ball is tilted somewhat towards the light keeps hitting it. But right about this point right here, the surface of the ball is either parallel or turning away from the light, so the light is actually just going right on past it. Okay, and we actually do want to kind of try to understand that as much as we can, because it helps us analyze visually what we're looking at when we want to draw something, or even if we're making something up in our head that we want to draw, it helps us create believable illusions of light and shade. So essentially, this line right here represents the point at which the light source is no longer hitting the surface of this object. And in here, we have the shadow, which we'll just try to fill in as evenly as we can. This cast shadow is essentially darkness that is created because something is standing between the light source and it. So these cast shadows tend to be quite a bit flatter than these. You'll notice in these shadows that you can often sort of get a sense of the curve of the shape, where these tend to just sort of lay flat. Okay. The other thing that'll happen is light will often bounce over here, hit something, bounce into a shadow, and then back into sort of the interior of this shadow shape here. And that's actually what's called reflected light. So sometimes you'll see it gets a little bit lighter in the shadow in there. And you'll notice those. If it's something that causes confusion when you're starting to draw, it's okay to just sort of ignore the reflected light at first. But it can help you get sort of different types of effects later on. We also notice that the shadow tends to get a little bit darker right before it moves into the area where there's actually light. Okay. We also have some darker shadows right where objects meet, like where this ball meets the floor here. And when we're looking over in the light side, what we will have here is where the light is hitting this ball most directly is where we're going to have our highlight. Okay. So everything else around this highlight will not be totally white. It'll be sort of lesser light. And we'll have different gradients of this lesser light as it moves slowly away from the light. Okay. One of the trickier parts of understanding this is that this part right here is an area where if this highlight is where the light is hitting the ball directly, perpendicularly, this is actually where it's hitting it very indirectly, and we call this raking light. And this light can be actually sort of difficult to see. So for our purposes here, if we draw our things lightly and loosely, use our basic shapes, we should be able to get a sense of where shadows would fall and what their general appearance would be like, and we can give our drawings more volume as we create them. So what I want you to do is make some basic shapes, whether it's, say, like a cube or an oval, and just sort of play around with where shadows might be on them. What the general shape of the shadow might be, or what planes on something like a cube the shadows would be on. And try to fill in your shadows as evenly as possible, because that will help them lay flat.